Hello everyone, today we talk about Sino-Arab warfare and the Battle of the Talas River. As you know, so far I have two types of battle videos. The most prominent, because it also aligns with my personal specialization, is proper battle tactical reconstruction from primary sources, etc. So this is not a video about this, regardless of the fact that naturally sources for these times and places are relatively contained, to say the least. Then there is another type of video that is more recent, though in this sense less frequent in the past years, regarding the times and meanings of these battles, right? And this video is neither of them, but it sort of resembles the latter because it's basically designed to describe Sino-Arab war, Chinese-Arab warfare. But given the circumstantial situation of these two powers and the fact that, so we're talking, we'll see now, essentially the 7th, the 8th century. So it's the rise of Islam, of the Caliphate, and from the other side, Tang China, that is sort of dealing with lots of interesting affairs, plus sort of, in fact, from major frontier for both powers that we have analyzed. I haven't created a playlist about it, but it's fundamentally Central Asian politics and warfare that we made lots of videos about. In fact, this just gave me the idea of creating probably a regional playlist about the videos we've already done, mostly describing the enemies of China, like in this case, but also sort of from a Western perspective, because I think that it's very important not just to study in parallel, in particular European and Chinese warfare throughout the millennia, not only those, but in fact, in this case, as a juncture, right? What was happening specifically in between in Central Asia, as it really shows how close, if you want, the extremities of Eurasia were, historically speaking, how much contact and how much also conflict and competition existed. Naturally, this is a bit different because in between there were sort of different powers, the same caliphate is technically not Europe, but in a sense, like these two extremities of Eurasia dealing with one another, also in pretty violent terms, like in this case. The Battle of the Talas River is very famous. It's not just this geographical location really amazing us in looking, oh, look, there is a contact between the two sides in a more directly military sense, right? We know that some Roman prisoners forcibly conscripted in the Parthian army after Carrhae came to fight on the eastern frontier against the Chinese, right? I also made a video, if anything, referring partly to this, but we'll come back on that. At least it's all very sort of hypothetical, but the sources are pretty convincing, especially regarding the equipment there that is sort of described from the Parthian side. But aside from this, the Battle of the Talas River is a bit more famous. It was a big thing, right? Not as big as the sources say, but we've also learned how to interpret numbers, especially in the very historiographical tradition of these polities, which is not just claiming something beyond reality, but rather sort of giving a specific symbolical meaning to quantities, which is a concept that in the West we don't have quite much from the beginning, in fact, of historiography. Herodotus considered this. And an extent for the Eastern world, and also such a close one like the Islamic one, is a very sort of pronounced thing. And this is particularly highlighted in the Crusades historiography. We've reconstructed lots of battles of that kind, showing how, the Westerners had a much more, in that sense, rational and sort of critical approach to history compared to the Muslims that were just sort of squaring the circle or circling the square in a way, and proposing sort of probably a different narrative. This is partly connected with this. Now, the broader context, the Caliph successor to Muhammad at this point had dispatched Arab mercenaries under the Rashidun Caliphate to assist Li Shimin, the founder of the Tang dynasty and Emperor Taizong, who reigned between 626 and 649, In his ascension to power amid the chaotic transition from the Sui dynasty to the Xuanwu Gate incident in 626, we'll see better another time. I made a video about Tang warfare if you're interested, so there is some of a broader context there. And this had basically established an uneasy alliance between essentially the Islamic and Chinese realms, sealed, by the way, through shared interests in countering mutual steppe threats. Because that fundamentally was the deal. Consider that at this point in history, the Sasanians and also their leftovers are still there. So there is a problem that had accumulated, in fact, the rulers of Levant, the Byzantines, the Romans, and now the Muslims, inasmuch as Persia constituted this main bulwark, prevent sort of living off the transcontinental trade across the Central Asia, in fact, between China and the Roman Empire, preventing, in fact, some more straightforward contacts, exacting tolls, and so on. It's a bit like after the Pax Mongolica. As long as the Mongols, namely, at least controlled everything, there was a great exchange. Lots of Europeans lived in China at that point as a consequence of this open highways. But with the 14th century crisis, everything collapses. The Mongol empire splits into different successor states, and things come back like before. And here, therefore, Sasanian Persia was more than just an obvious enemy for the Arabs, as it was springing out from their new fate, so to say. It was actually heavily derived from the Iranian one, including like the concept of jihad in a deeper, this all peoples had the concept of holy war, but there were some aspects that were heavily derived from Persia that, as you know, also will be overrun by the Muslims. After it had, by the way, been heavily destructured by Heraclius, exhausting both contenders for the Arabs to take over, also in a more dramatic time than we realize, right? We will talk more about Islamic history, the so-called Islamic Golden Age. Everything it's a bit more dysfunctional than it seems. Like, don't be fooled by the size of the caliphate that is enormous, and there is no doubt it was something incredible, clamorous, important to study and to evaluate, but also something that basically fragmented as soon as it reached, in fact, the Indus from one side, the Atlantic from the other. And we have, in fact, the Battle of the Talas River today as yet another direction of advance. That is, you see, what is fascinating in general, what you find also in medieval history manuals, it's especially when it comes to the early Islamic invasions and the establishment of the caliphate and the various sort of successors to that, the enormity of the environment, cultures, sort of climate, like the specificity, especially in this case, of a Central Asian regional military culture. As you understand here, it's not like they were from Damascus, literally marching up to, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, in particular with the Talas battle. We don't even know exactly whether, we don't have a battlefield to begin with in a strictly tactical sense. We have some hypotheses regarding where this was fought. More or less, we know the province, we know the horizon, but it's also something lost to an incredibly archaic and especially sort of particularly, say, disadvantagedly developed, let's put it in this way, Central Asian context, which renders everything more complicated and renders also, however, this clash essentially a decentralized one. All right, there will be lots of commanders historically that will try from Central Asia to cross into China. This happened also for some Mongol tribes, as you know, were broken. Also, this before the King Gizit rose to power, went to the west to come back to the east. Timur Lane later died essentially on the eve of his expedition into China, something like that. In any case, in 674, Sasanian Persia under Yazdegerd III, reigning between 632 and 651, look at which years, right, in Islamic perspective, the last Sasanian king proper and a formal ally of Tang China at the time, via earlier diplomatic exchanges and refugee receptions at the Tang court urgently requested aid from the Tang Emperor Gaozong, who reigned between 649 and 683, against the currently invading Islamic cavalry of the Umayyad Caliphate under Caliph Muawiyah I, who reigned, as you know, between 661 and 680. However, the plea, delivered via envoys fleeing the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah's aftermath, was ignored due to Tang priorities, obviously, in consolidating Korean campaigns. At that point, I have made a video about multiple ones at this point. Medieval Korean warfare is very interesting and very relevant also for the Chinese Empire at this point. Leading thus, or at least, witnessing to later, the overrun of Sassanid Persia, centered in Ctesiphon, modern Iraq, so not necessarily Persia, but of course what the Sassanians had developed, more of a like a state that was a bit like impossible to do in the Iranian plateau, near the ruins of ancient Babylon. Another part of, at this point, Central Asia that the Muslims overrun was Bactria, around Balkh, modern Afghanistan, a key Zoroastrian center, by the way, and Sogdiana, around Samarkand, modern Uzbekistan, hub of Iranian-speaking merchants that would also become, one of the single most important cities as far as the properly Islamic culture, science, etc. They were all basically Khwarezmians, like in origin. If you look at them, the great scholars of the Islamic Golden Age. It's a very interesting aspect of this very fringe area, the contact with the steppes. I also made some videos about Bactrian and Sogdian Iron Age warfare, so if you're interested in that, there is hardly at this point anything that Schwerpunkt hasn't at least cursorily treated. And so, despite the similar appeals for support echoed in Tang annals, the Sasanian Empire had been overrun by this new force, this fresh faith, and in fact military threat as far as the Chinese frontier could turn. It would be perhaps counterproductive now to digress on how you would expect sort of political goals, a strategic deterrent, and proper military campaigns to be carried out at the end of the 7th, beginning of the 8th century. However, you understand that if you are expanding, like the Caliphate was doing, there had to be a pretty muscular show of force that required some pretty bold and daring capacity to overrun everything, which was something in the mindset of the Muslims at this point was very much exciting their own fantasies from sort of essentially just Arab Bedouins, more leaders, caravans, raiders, to now in possession of an unprecedented level of power. And by the way, consider that many Arabs had served in the Byzantine, in the Sasanian army, so they knew what was going on. This was something, in fact, millenary in Arab history. I made some videos about also ancient Arab warfare. These tribes had always loomed like at the outskirts of civilization to seize any good chance to ravage, as it happened also during the sort of cyclical collapse of certain Mesopotamian civilization, etc., without accomplishing more than much. In fact, if you look at the same Islamic conquest, you look at an Arabized elite that eventually took over, co-opted and lorded over peoples that did most of the work for them, right? That were, if anything, also exploiting the Islamic wave to sabotage other powers, including the Byzantine one. Like Egypt opened the door, the gates, sort of to the Muslims. There is no doubt for all the issues that were going on between Constantinople and Alexandria. But it's China that interests us now. So from 707 to 713, the Arabs of the Umayyad Caliphate focused on consolidating power along China's western borders and in the Tarim Basin. This famous desert basin in modern Xinjiang, China, dotted with garrison oasis towns like Kucha and Karashar. I made a video about Kushan warfare that is also connected with Kushan warfare because the etymology is actually the same. And it's a derivative, in fact, of this broader Indo-European and in particular Tocharian culture that was incredibly self-aware from a ethno-racial point of view until very late in time when the Turks essentially took them all around. This time, they had, the Kushans in China, in India had taken over as part of the broader Indo-Scythian conquest of the continent. They were sort of more feudal, etc. These powers of the Tarim basin were mostly city-states. Literally, like the center of the basin is desertic, and there is the Tarim River crossing, but essentially most of the settlements are born on the outskirts of this that are also heavily mountainous, because this is surrounded also by, Himalaya in the south, like it's all mountains around. And this was a veritably vivacious regional pool, also from a military point of view, and very important because these city-states, of course, control the aforementioned intercontinental caravan routes between Europe and Asia. And the sort of triggering element here for the Chinese is that the caliphate has managed to leverage tribute from these local realms. As you know, the Tocharians were essentially a western branch of the Indo-Europeans, like, the Celts or the Italics or whatever, that migrated millennia before to, in fact, even east, more east than the Iranian branch of the Eastern European branch, however you want to call it, displaying, in fact, very striking similarities linguistically, culturally, and so on with properly Europeans. So, again, I made videos about both the Kuchan and Kushan warfare, so there you can find everything you want. We'll surely come back on these peoples because they're very fascinating. But of course, at this point, they're decadent. There is, as I was saying before, when you look at the Islamic invasions, not much a sense of rebirth, but one of exhaustion that allows the Arabs to take over much of these lands. By 712, under Muhammad bin Qasim, Umayyad general, died in 715, the Arabs attacked the Oasis kingdom of India's King Dyer of the Brahmin dynasty. A name, a brand, I would say, consider our videos on Vedic religion. He reigned between 679 and 712 in Sindh, so essentially modern Pakistan along the lower Indus River, with Bactrians from Balkh, famed for its Buddhist stupas that were historically also tied with probably the Hellenic identity of Bactria that predated also Alexander's conquest. There were some Cretans that had been settled as military colonists by the Achaemenids there, and they had also in fact seceded as Bactria when Alexander came around, because they preferred sort of the Achaemenid autonomies than sort of Alexander's view of power. At least they took advantage of the decentralized position to break themselves free. And some aspects of Zen, for example, seemingly derived from these Hellenic thinkers in Central Asia. You have Bactrians from Balkh, Syrians from Damascus. There was at that point the Umayyad capital, allied to the Arabs as auxiliary forces as well, because as we've seen, the Muslims had managed to project their power that far, and here were sort of more Western peoples than the Tarim Basin that joined the venture, because they were heavily involved historically just with their neighbors and constantly at war. Very unstable, but in this sense stimulating region. After 713, the Arabs began pushing the Chinese Empire eastward. That is to say, the sort of sway that China had over these lands in general, because it was the greatest landmass, the strongest power around, began to evaporate. In a sense, this happened paradoxically because the Arabs were not really as powerful as the Chinese in the area, and so given that the power balance was in any case pretty fragile, for these Sogdians, Bactrians, etc., it was sort of, even for part of the Kuchans, easier to back this more distant power than the Chinese that would have routinely come to resubjugate this place, so seeking for autonomy and therefore joining the Islamic ranks, at least in a manpower sense. The religious history here is very complex, and of course Islam was partially spread in these areas historically, but not entirely, right? And in imperfect ways, especially at this point in history. At this point, the Arabs were expanding their boundaries while enlisting even Tibetan allies from the Tibetan Empire under the Emperor Trizong Datsen, reigned between 755 797. Guess what? I also made a video about Tibetan warfare during this era. So there we are, essentially southeast compared to this, in very unrocked positions, nested in almost impregnable mountains. There is as you know, in Tibet, a very strong religious military tradition, local Buddhist monasteries and so on. There's actually a lot of religious infighting. And Tibet is, from one side, actually closer to China, so to the extent that it's actually easy for the Tibetans to launch raids into China, while it's much more complicated for China to reach Tibet or to wage war there, as opposed to the Tarim Basin, that is much more easily accessible, even though it's more distant. Earlier ties, by the way, had already existed via joint raids on Tang outposts dating to the 1670s. We're talking Islamic forces that, in a way or another, had gotten there. Unfortunately, we don't have many details, as you can understand, but we know that as early as a few decades, essentially, after the Gira, some Arab errant horsemen had reached up to there, joining the locals and exploiting the general political mess that was following in a pretty disrupted, like we're talking the 7th century. It's one of the darkest and more contracted moment in the history of civilization. Very scarce material resources, you can imagine, even in Central Asia, by the way. But evidently there was enough to graze, so to say, at this point, to get involved so far as well. Human mobility is probably one of the single most underestimated aspects in the history of mankind. This Arab-Tibetan alliance is quite fascinating because it faced a challenge from the Chinese general Gao Xianzi. It was actually a Korean-born tank commander. We've seen it in action in the video about tank warfare. He died in 756. He was, in fact, probably of Goguryeo descent, which is probably of Korean, where the word Korea stems from, who had on that occasion crossed the Pamirs, the mountain range spanning modern Tajikistan, China, and Afghanistan, with passes like the Vakhan Corridor, in a maneuver reminiscent of, and in this sense likely also surpassing, Hannibal's Alpine crossing, to position himself behind their forces amid the rugged Hindu Kush foothills, though this proved merely a temporary delay amid broader pressures, including the Khitan, a nomadic people from modern Inner Mongolia, and Manchuria turning against China following failed Tang alliances. And guess, again, Wu made a video about the Khitan, admittedly mostly the Liao dynasty, so that this was more like people that already existed at the time, but eventually also rose to power in some parts of China, and that's also the one that we were talking about before. At some point will be destroyed, will move west, and there's quite some interesting story about that. In any case, by 751, the Khitan had defeated the Chinese at the Liao River in modern Liaoning province, China, near the Bohai Gulf, setting the stage for the Arabs to subdue them, so the same Chinese, so doubling down that at the Battle of the Talas River, that we identify as near modern Taraz, Kazakhstan, along the fertile Yaxartes Valley. These were areas where, also Alexander, as you know, had arrived, famous clash against the Saka, and I'm preparing actually a video on this. The confrontation at Talas emerged from Tang intervention in the kingdom of Shash, modern Tashkent, capital of modern Uzbekistan, a wall Silk Road entrepot, where Gao Xiangxi led an army of Tang, mostly Tang infantry, from the Anxi Protectorate headquartered in Kucha, modern Xinjiang, one of 4 Tang frontier protectorates, and Karluk mercenaries. These were mostly cavalrymen, Turkic tribes from the Tian Shan mountains, spanning modern Kyrgyzstan and China, basically the ethnic cradle of almost all the great steppe conquerors since Indo-European times. The same sagas, even the Alans, were born there. At this point, the Turks had overrun the place. But as we've seen also in some recent videos, there was a lot of Indo-European blood around, because basically So some peoples like the Kyrgyzs were documented as red-haired by the Chinese. So there was a lot of blend there. It's not like a simple Turkification, especially from a genetic point of view of these areas. And this is already very typical. You have a essentially Chinese force of barely Chinese people, telling the truth, that however were trained, levied, trained, armed by the Chinese in imperial cadres of infantry. These were still considered barely mostly like local militia, and so from areas that had also their own local military tradition, historically had as sedentaries, semi-sedentaries to cope with the raids of the steppes horsemen, a reason for which they had backed China against them and favored her penetration of the Terran base and beyond. So back in the force of civilization. At the same time, you can't go out there in Central Asia without cavalry. So you have the Karluks that are some sort of brutal, primitive Turkic horsemen that fight in the same identical way their steppe counterpart, the Tang nomadic enemies do, right? And in fact, you have different elements from, as we've seen pretty much everywhere, even singing tribes is very common during the migration year and beyond, from both sides as well. So this is also a sizable force, as we'll learn now. It's not really irrelevant, and it has a very delicate task because this is not merely some sort of provincially relevant scenario. It's really the struggle in this frontier between these immense powers that would have also barely known or understood each other, right? China, with its sort of millenary, sort of crystallized tradition and sort of an incredible civilizational legacy, etc. The Arabs emerging as an incredibly novel power that, regardless of course, the bases, as we were saying before, that they were exploiting from other civilizations, were also, religiously speaking, something substantially different, to say the least, compared to the Chinese. So this expedition of the Tangs was directed against the local king of the of Shash, who had clashed with the Ikshid of Fergana. Fergana Valley, like very famous other in a nearby area, so to say, modern Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, renowned for the heavenly horses that, say, the Macedonian Etharoi used, that Augustus took to Rome after having conquered Egypt. We're talking some, in fact, of the most advanced and, at this point, sort of culturally synergic equestrian forces of essentially of a dying, a completely dying antiquity that had still something to that, especially Iranian dominance, Iranian style of knighthood that the Turks tried to keep, but sort of collapse under the exhaustion probably of the entire system during the early Middle Ages. I made, as you know, a series about Eurasian steppe warfare that documents this sort of layering, but also gradual weakening of the various steppes waves, at least in interest of actual cohesive quality. All right. Now, the Ikshid had sought Chinese assistance via embassies, but after the king of Shash surrendered and submitted, Gao's forces plundered the city regardless, which is never a good thing, especially when you're very far away from home and you kind of depend on this local subjects for almost everything, supplies in particular. The Chinese seized Tamga's seals and treasures, and the king himself was executed in Chang'an, the Tang capital, modern Xi'an, China, with its grand Daming Palace, on Emperor Xuanzong's reign between 712-756 orders amid court intrigues. Not a wise choice to begin with. The Karluks in particular would have been particularly happy to plunder, well, also the Galaxy Protectorate infantrymen for that matter. But it's as brutal as it gets. It's not like the Chinese are it's particularly tender-hearted and unstained sort of culture for that matter, the king's son then appealed to the Abbasids. So you realize it's a feud and counter feud, bringing essentially the Muslims there. The Abbasids at this point had overthrown the Umayyads in 750 under Caliph Abu al-Abbas al-Safar, reigned between 750 and 754. Last year I made a video explicitly about this regime change at the head of the Caliphate, the Middle Eastern Caliphate, that explains a bit how the mechanism had occurred, including as far as this Western Eurasian steppes elements had contributed to properly to help the Abbasid rise against an ever more sort of xenophobic and especially centralistic Umayyad state in Syria. This is properly the Black Banners Revolution. So the son of this destroyed king of Shash, humiliated, dishonored, broken, and naturally very rancorous for that, asked the Abbasids, that were at this point through the roof and overconfident, for aid. We are in 751. Earlier regional tensions had shaped this conflict. The oasis towns along the Silk Road, trade routes linking China to the Mediterranean, as we've seen, carrying silk, paper, and spices, once under Turkish control, a Western Turkic confederation based around Suyab near modern Tokmak, Kyrgyzstan, site of Nestorian Christian inscriptions, but there were lots of Nestorians all across Asia at this point, fell into chaos in the late 7th century and amid Kagan succession disputes that are naturally very typical these areas, prompting Empress Wu Zetian, reigned between 609 and 705, that is China's only female emperor, or at least she technically wasn't an emperor, but that's also what we have to talk about tradition. Soon again to retake the Tarim Basin from the Tibetans under Emperor Tridu Dzongtsen, reigning between 776, 704, and 692 at the Battle of Kashgar, securing vital income for the Tang through caravan taxes. As you understand, the struggle was largely at this point over these because, in other words, the various regional pools had historically shrunk, right? But China at this point does not have the power that it had in the past as well. There are still pretty massive, impressive armies. There is a lot of continuity, but a great deal of riches at this point can be obtained as a viable surplus for governmental stability through the control of this Central Asian corridor. And that's when the Muslims are not welcome. And also the local populations realize how worth they are in order to sort of sponsor this or that power for individual gain. Now, in 705, Qutayb ibn Muslim, that was the Umayyad governor of Khorasan, they're more or less out there in the frontier, died 715, exploited Turgesh infighting to conquer Bukhara, major city, modern Uzbekistan, will become one of the Islamic capitals of the Golden Age, with its ancient Ark citadel, and Samarkand, as we said before, Sogdian capital, modern Uzbekistan, famed for Registan squares. While Turgesh Kagan Suluk, who reigned roughly between 715 and 738, unified his tribes through anti-Arab coalitions. We see from both sides there are reasons to side with both. And that's also why the Battle of the Talas River materializes to begin with, so far away from both empires. Tang forces reinstated the deposed Ikshid of Fergana in 715 with 10,000 soldiers. Numbers are sort of debatable. They may have been 1,000 as a matter of fact. But, let's not put limits to providence in general. Against Umayyad and Tibetan support for his rival Alutar, a local usurper backed by Arab gold. And in 717 repelled an Umayyad Tibetan siege of Aksu, the oasis city in modern Xinjiang, guarded by beacon towers. You understand how complex the alignments were, because again, Tibet is literally from the other side of Eurasia, and still it can't find, for this reason in part, some elements sort of in common against the Chinese from the Caliphate. And so in between, you can imagine all the clashes, all the war bands, all the things that we don't really know were going on in this pretty tormented area by this point in history that, again, had gone under a profound crisis and destabilization. The aforementioned Tokharians will essentially disappear at this point as a self-identifying, if anything, culture and populace. Suluk's invasion of the Tarim Basin with Tibetan aid were driven back by Tang cavalry under Ashinaxian, a Turkic Tang general of Göktürk lineage. I made a video about the Göktürks as far as their warfare in particular is concerned as well. And his forces suffered defeats by the Tang in 736 near Suzhou and the Caliphate in 737 at Karistan, free for all. Naturally, all powers at this point are largely relying on Turkic horsemen in this area to carry out the war. Basically, the Gulams / Mamluks are present in the Islamic world as early as the invasions, the early Islamic invasions began. It would be interesting to see how many Turks, aside from the Huns, that are sort of the more famous name, but already came from pretty far away places in I don't know, in the same Arabia or North Africa before, like say in Byzantine times. We don't sort of set our mind on that in perspective because it seems like this is all a post-history, but it's actually a very close time between the two things. The Karluks, producers of iron weapons exported to Tibet and the Tang via ally forges, had settlements around the Tian Shan, the mountain range in, as we've seen, modern Kyrgyzstan/China with alpine pastures. This is really typical of their military style, advanced metallurgy, lots of sort of cattle breeding, horse breeding and so on, mobility, nomadism, ravages, plunders, and so on. Traumatically primitive peoples, in particular at this time in history and in these places, but they're also very effective for this reason, because they were in many ways closer to the higher sort of initiation to supreme sort of celestial warfare and tendency in their knightly equestrian tradition. They would have been very interesting to observe from all sides. In 747, Gao Xiangxi subdued the Tibetans in the Pamirs at the Little Bolor Pass and controlled Gilgit region in modern Pakistan-administered Kashmir, strategic for gem trade, and as you understand, quite crucial for contacts with India in the south. While the Abbasid revolution unfolded, by the way, with Abu Muslim Khorasani revolutionary died 755, occupying Merv, the ancient Antiochia in Marjana, one of the early Alexandrias before the Mongol invasions, apparently the largest city in the world, debatably the largest city in the world, capital of, at this point, of Greater Khorasan, to modern Turkmenistan/Iran, a Persian cultural hub. In 748, and the Umayyads falling at the Zab River in modern Iraq near Mosul in 750. Pretty bloody settlement of the successful Abbasid revolution. So this is how the Arabs and the Chinese, with great approximation considering their respective forces composition, came to meet at the Talas River. Again, Taran's ancient city in modern Kazakhstan, its surrounding area somewhere having apparently hosted this settlement. There are medieval caravanserais. It's where also logistically these armies would march across against one another for obvious supplying reasons. The battle unfolded over 5 days in July 751. Just spatially, you understand, this is basically on the modern Kazakhstan-Kyrgyzstan border. So also some of the most beautiful places ever, I think, especially Tajikistan, having strikingly beautiful landscape. One day I would like to visit just for the landscape, which is something that I rarely do, but I find it really breathtaking. It's a symbol of this sort of crossroad. It's at some point a landscape that you start barely recognizing because it enters probably an Eastern Eurasian dimension you don't even recognize it. It is so archetypally and symbolically loaded that it's really fantastic and perfect setting for this battle. Lasting 5 days because these engagements are complicated. At least the confrontation would last, apparently, by the way, the sources are what they are, we can't fully tell. But if you look at the Battle of the Yarmouk, if you look at other confrontations, there is the sense that these battles were quite sort of prepared by the same contenders, mostly because there was so much at stake, and so neither side would like to just unbalance itself too much. Big armies, pretty far away from their bases, right, to fall back on. So whoever wins big, and everybody is extreme. Like the stakes are immense, and there is an incredibly crushing pressure on both sides, even probably to finally clash against one another, which is, however, what strategy forces them to do. You have the Tang under Gao Xiangxi facing the Abbasids led by Ziyad ibn Salih. There was the Arab governor of Samarkand, who died essentially the same year, supported by Tibetan allies and Karluk mercenaries. Around the same period of the battle, supported by Tibetan allies and Karluk mercenaries himself, as you've seen, so basically it's difficult to distinguish. There are some ethnic differences, but in Central Asia also between, I don't know, the Tibetans themselves at some point absorbed at least lots of predatory Turkic elements into their ranks. There was a real similarity, is really what I want to say here, between the Abbasid and the Tang forces, because they largely fight not through proxies, because they literally command just their forces, but lots of allies, lots of auxiliaries from the Central Asian population. The Tang forces were bolstered by Fergana cavalry and Karkata support from Kashmir under King Lalitaditha Muktapida, reigning between 724-760, the conqueror of Kanauji. The Tangs, as you understand here, are actually the more structured force compared to the Abbasids. There are Abbasids, but again, levying forces most from the sort of the local territories as well. There would be sort of an Arab elite and other elements from the rest of the caliphate, especially from the Middle East. Lots of Persians as well. Right? So you would actually think that China was the strongest force here, at least probably expressed a tighter military culture to some extent, but there are also very similar forces. Estimates of the same army sizes vary wildly. As we were saying before, don't mind numbers too much, or at least don't take them literally. In Chinese records, you have claims to up to 200,000 Abbasid troops, which definitely would have been a marvel to see, including 20 to 30,000 Karluks. So basically, we can easily say there were maybe 20,000 Abbasid troops, which would have already been pretty big for the times and places, with 2,000-3,000 Karluks. It's the proportion that matters. It's basically more than 1 to 10. So you realize already just the Karluks as also wholly external forces to the Abbasids, constituting a robust component, especially of the cavalry, we can expect, which makes a lot of sense, obviously, for those kind of terrains, versus 10 to 30,000 Tang and allies, which also sort of makes sense. It's possible, again, that the Chinese had the qualitative edge, but as you understand here, more or less the two forces are balanced, right? It makes perfectly sense to think, 15,000 versus 15,000, something like that. Arabic sources reverse this. Interestingly enough, 100,000 Chinese which may be a cultural difference simply, but it could also mean that the Chinese were actually slightly inferior in number. Modern assessments suggesting around 30,000 per side amid the riverine plains seem also a bit too optimistic, perhaps. Again, it's not much a problem of these forces home to be able to field pretty big armies for that matter. But if you look at properly the places and how distant they were from any kind of stronger bases and sort of military structure available and sustainable, so logistically, in these places, like you realize how maybe 15, 20,000 is already a big deal, by the way, as a battle. We'll talk more about early Islamic warfare because we really made very few videos on this, and if anything, we have to talk mostly about the Byzantines from the other side. So I'm planning something because actually there isn't so much, even iconographically speaking, about this era, especially about the Arabs. So also for making videos that may be a problem, right? But still we will invent something. Islamic armies relied on unarmored horse archers and cameleers, not very differently from their foes. Armored cavalry with lamellar coats for the elite, or element. Artillery like mangonels. Remember that the Chinese will import Arab military engineers throughout this period and the later ones from the Middle East, in a small infantry component, with sultanates providing the core and auxiliaries like the Syrians and Bactrians occasionally involved. The organization followed the decimal system, which is typical of the steppes in particular, but also the Arabs did to some extent. I made an early Schwerpunkt video about this, their tactics, their numbers, and the early Islamic invasions era, with units of 10 led by Asar-i Khalid, hundreds by Asipa Salar, thousands by an Amir, and tens of thousands by a Malik. So as basically a king, right? The Amir is, mostly a military commander in the Islamic hierarchy. The latter organization was seen in, for example, Muhammad bin Qasim's 712 force with 6,000 camels and 3,000 camel baggage train loaded with catapults, interestingly enough. Maybe some sort of catapult camel, so to say, along the way. The Arabs had to quickly adapt to the tough weathers of Khorasan. The camels are incredibly effective. The aforementioned march of the Chinese across the Pamir mountains had been carried out thanks to the logistical advantages provided by these animals. Incredibly resilient and storing, as you know, fat in their humps to survive, not water actually that they have to get otherwise, and allow in fact to sustain themselves with calories with fat for a consistently large amount of time. Terrible temperature excursions, as a matter of fact. So overall, you see a typical force you would expect for the times and places for the Arabs. The notion that it would have been a scarce infantry is plausible to the extent that at least the Chinese would have apparently had more, right? But also here we're not really too clearly informed. Consider that Sogdiana and Bactria had some substantial sanitary force. There were local levies, as we've seen in the relative warfare videos up to this time in history, that would have in fact simply stemmed from the largely sort of the fertile areas, the cities also, that, as we said, were also pretty big, sizable. They didn't have much of a statal control in a territorial sense. The whole sense of public authority was pretty deteriorated here, especially with the steppes, more years all across the perturbed public peace, so to say. But at the same time, it's exactly this type of environment that had allowed for the cities to develop some important militia organization. Besides, it's really interesting that the Arabs brought with themselves some catapults as well. This of course occurred because regardless of the bigger battles, there were fortresses to subdue along the way. Also, as a much regular business, this was not a simple venture where nobody had ever reached. Like more or less, at least everybody knew how to get there and what kind of obstacles laid in the way. As far as the Tang forces are concerned, you can check out the video made on the Tang army. You'll keep talking about them, but as I just said, the armies were pretty similar. The composition was almost identical in general, and if anything, we can think the Tangs had a bit more infantry, at least some sort of more rank and file, sort of imperially recruited infantry, plus, however, lots of auxiliaries and lots of weird stuff they can collect it along the way as well. Now, for the first 3 days, Tang crossbows outranged Abbasid archers, compelling retreats behind spearmen. This was a very important element in Tang forces. China had to cope with horse archery from the steppe for a very long time, so this capacity to, as we've seen, levy some sort of organized peasant militia, equipping them with crossbows that are relatively easy to operate differently from bows and so on, could create mass, had an important range, and could keep at bay horse archers. Because at the end of the day, those are not the greater problem. They can't be countered effectively also literally like this. You can imagine the Abbasids here using their Karluk mercenaries to sort of test the ground, and of course realizing that the Chinese were sort of better organized than most of the peoples they had met, especially in this sort of eastern part of what the caliphs had succeeded in taking over. Through already like a very decentralized military structure, so integrating lots of those sort of steppe elements as well. So initially, Tangs have make an interesting figure, right? They have an important display of power. Tanks have also more infantry, and they're heavy ones, superior in scale armor, because at least we think this is a bit of a conjecture, but that's, again, a more infantry-biased force like the Tangs that follow some more standardized uniform ways of equipment, even though we're talking the early Middle Ages, China was sort of pretty deteriorated as well in any statal sense, but would have this sanitary bias and therefore better armor. This is really significant. And as such, in fact, repel charges and advanced despite numerical inferiority, which, as we've seen, seems to have been a thing there. This is also very important because, of course, there weren't just horse archers facing Chinese infantry. Cavalrymen were clashing from both sides, especially on the flanks. Tang heavy infantry managed to repel the heavily armored cavalrymen from the Abbasid side, Arab, Persian, Turkic, whatever, as of course combined armed tactics were being played. Like those guys had more sort of heavy cavalry plus archers. The Tangs had stereotypically more heavy infantry and foot archers. Abbasid cavalry Abbasid cavalry flank attacks were being countered by Tang reserves under geodesic formations. The Chinese obviously were aware of the tricks the enemy would employ, also because they used Karluks from their side as well. On the fourth day, the Karluks, comprising 2/3 of the Tang force, apparently at least, because here the narrative is that the Tangs had more infantry than the Abbasids, but this was still minority compared to probably the larger force of mostly nomadic auxiliaries from both sides. I personally think that there was actually more infantry than we think at large. So these are just estimates, and you should really look at primary sources to gather like the minimum sort of informed guess about what could have been, because we don't really know 100% to begin with. And these Karluks are pretty sort of treacherous, as they defect and or assaulted properly from their rear the same Tang army on the fifth day amid bribe inducements. as Abbasid pressed frontally with war cries shattering Tang lines by nightfall. This happens frequently. There are betrayals all the time, especially in this very politically fluid circumstances. Essentially, if you were a Karluk chieftain and you were just at the head of your own retinues, you're part of some war bands, etc. You were essentially fighting against your opponent from the other side, but you also knew that if your own sponsor here got too strong, remember what we said before regarding that China was actually the stronger power, could reactivate a dominance in the area. You could have gone too low there, could have lost a great part of your autonomy. And so if the Abbasids, between a clash and another at night, sent envoys and were sort of trying to bribe you out, and everything was, as you understand here, also pretty informal, right, in terms of camps, etc. Probably these auxiliaries maintained some autonomy as well, with their own sentinels, whatever. So everything was permeable, and this betrayal was in general in the air. The Chinese were also aware of this possible reality. So it's not much just being abandoned by your allies, especially if you're already in numerical inferiority. That's not good. But if these properly turn on you to gain something from the other side, things can get really bad. So Gao retreated to camp, but Li Siyue, the Tang general, died in 756, persuaded him against further combat to avoid annihilation, as they could have taken the field yet another day. This also speaks of the important discipline and cohesion of the Chinese force here, even with militia, and or if there would have been some imperial soldier proper, obviously, to stiffen the Chinese forces, also heavy cavalry and lighter one to a degree next to the infantry, which also tells us in the sense that nothing was particularly lost, especially if you think that these armies could have been, 15,000 strong. They already spent on a terrain that they have known at least for days. They have suffered losses. So they're not enormously large contingents. They can also rock themselves in different parts of the camp, looking at one another from the same side after the Karluk betrayal. It's a very dangerous reality, telling the truth. And that's how the Tang finally withdrew eastward over the Tian Shan the next morning via icy defiles. Because, of course, also getting back through other paths was dangerous, and this was already seemingly something suicidal. Former Fergana allies, in fact, ambushed the Chinese retreat at narrow gorges, though Li Siyue's cavalry carved an escape with Modao's swords, enabling Gao and about 2,000 survivors to reach Tang territory, which is quite fascinating. We don't know, again, how many survivors actually got back, quote-unquote, home, because it was mostly just like a frontier outpost they had to get to. But it's basically impossible to determine. Chinese sources report 20 to 30,000 Tang dead. Arabic accounts claim 45,000 to 50,000 killed and 20,000, 25,000 captured, many later ransomed or integrated. You have naturally to understand who's writing when, also within China, which political faction, whatever, which is naturally very complicated. And, also Schwerpunkt has its own limits of philological assessment, but not because, we couldn't do that. It's rather that we have to talk about the whole picture. This was definitely an Abbasid victory anyway, and so we can imagine an important amount of Chinese dead. It may have even been the majority, also because, by the way, during the retreat they would have been hunted down, as we've seen. The fact that, however, there was a cohesive force that was able to pull out of there across such difficult terrain and opening themselves properly a way through an ambush, surviving and still being there in the thousands as a unitary force, tells us that this wasn't an annihilation. All right, there were surely very heavy losses, probably also in the ensuing retreat. Or withdrawal, if you prefer, as obviously the enemy would have pressed on. Maybe the core of the heavier Abbasid forces would have not pursued the Chinese. But those Karluks that were, by the way, now to sort of come back home, given that there had been now this massive political shift in favor of the Abbasids and retake from in the east what they thought was theirs from other also Karluk clans, maybe the same ones that had defected perhaps also, is that were immediately strengthened by the betrayal as well home is kind of evident. These guys normally chase, pursued, because that's what the horse archers really do. The Abbasids had essentially reached their goal, their objective of consolidating Transoxiana, so this historical region between the Amu Dari and the Sir-Draya rivers, modern Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, rich in irrigation canals that were ideal for sort of developing some further political territorial rule. Of course, as long as the Chinese did not appear once again, the Abbasids just held that side of the watershed, so to say, in a broader regional sense. And it's obvious that, they had made their stand and had succeeded. They were, however, obliged to halt any further advance due to logistical strains. I mean, even to fight on the Talas River was a major logistical feat to pull off. It was achievable. Again, it's not much a technical problem of range. It's more like a political cost reason. Like, where did you have to lead your forces? Where to, right? It was just about showing that you were the stronger. We said at the beginning, it was an ideological, a broader deterrent action. The Tang, by the way, retained the Eastern Central Asian influence until the 755 An Lushan rebellion, led by the eponymous general died in 757, of Sogdian Turkic origins, compelling full withdrawal from Western garrisons anyway. So this rebellion had naturally been deeply intertwined with what had just happened on the Talas River. The fact that also in China, at least in this frontier, you have an increasingly large amount of locals of Sogdian that are actually also from the other side, in part like in Turks, tells you how dependent the Saint Chinese at large were from the political violence of Central Asia. And that's why they needed so desperately to win at Talas, which would have ushered in some very interesting eras of Chinese control over territories that would have been still unstable, but at least would have probably resized the Islamic ambitions. Maybe it would have been Chinese expeditions, once again, like in antiquity, further west, because the same zeal and fanatic exaltation that the Muslims had shown there, it was all, met by some pretty stern Chinese understanding of sort of authority, of imperial power, and it would have been kind of warranted to witness something like that, which would have also likely opened, in fact, some contacts with the Byzantines, with the West. In any case, there were embassies of that kind. The Byzantines did talk with the Chinese at this point, and obviously were quite interested in what was happening in Central Asia. Naturally, again, it would have not really altered the broader international sort of Eurasian balance of power, but, right, it could have altered something, I don't know, on the western frontier of the Caliphate, etc. So that's quite interesting. Besides, the same caliphs and same Chinese emperors were not really interested in prolonging hostilities to begin with. In any case, they were neighbors now. They controlled this enormous land masses, were contiguous. After all, the Arabs had destroyed the Sassanians, and some trade could restart. In fact, diplomatic relations resumed swiftly between the two powers, with an Abbasid envoy arriving in December 752, bearing gifts of frankincense, followed by 4 visits in 752-53. This was a bit less of it was an official embassy, but it was also motivated by some more regional interests of the caliphs in the east, rather than and acting a bit as with deference towards the Chinese emperors, because they realized that at large, if the Chinese had really wanted, it could have gotten their revenge, but it was useless at that point. It was more like a definition of sort of sphere of influence. The test had occurred, blood had been shed, everything had been cost for both sides, regardless of the Chinese defeat at large. The Tang reconquered Gilgit in 753 under Feng Chunking. Tang commander died in 755, who replaced Gao amid purges. And Tashkent reasserting vassalage through tribute. Thus, as you understand, just by sheer sphere of influence, proxies, etc., China is anyway the strongest power in the area. Central Asian states like Samarkand, that is far west, sought Tang aid against the Abbasids via silk scrolls, and Fergana joined Chinese forces in Gansu province in northwest China, the gateway to the Yangtze corridor during the rebellion of 756. In 752, the ruler of the Principality of Ushurusana, around modern Istaravshan, Tajikistan, with its mountain strongholds, requested Tang support, declined likely due to Abbasid strength, however, and caused as a demand because of all that at the same time. In 754, 9 Western Turkestan kingdoms petitioned for attacks on the Abbasids. So it was understood at this point that China was very much needed. There had been a reversal of power in some areas, but at the same time, the Abbasids seemed now too cumbersome. Also, this request was refused amid internal strife. So you understand how much the Chinese are also seen as the rightful lord. If you study, for example, the ancient relation of certain tribes like the Sagas, for example, with China, they're pretty consistent, right? You can argue that we're also pretty close with one another. The islands, again, emerging from the Tian Shan as well. So you realize how close these powers historically had been. If anything, the problem is whatever is happening within China. That is far more important than anything was happening in the frontier by magnitudinal scale, therefore dictating more or less what was the Chinese properly availability for any broader frontier campaign or there. This frontier never lost importance, right? Military and political ties between the Tang and the Eastern Turkic princes were severed, leaving the Turks to confront the Abbasids alone, fostering fragmentation, some allying with Arabs via conversion incentives. So Islam was spreading there, others conducting raids before, also in this case, integration into Islamic civilization through madrasas. The Karluks, despite the role at Talas, sent diplomatic missions to the Tang in 752, like saying, well, sorry for what, can we be friends again? With horse gifts, because that's the deal. Submitted to the Chinese Empire in 753, captured a defecting Tang general for China to say, look, we're doing the service for you. And this was a big deal. I mean, the sense of lordship. We also discussed in some video the traditional view of leadership, of divinity, of the empire, and the Chinese tradition. And these peoples are heavily informed by probably Chinese mentality. The Abbasids are just the newcomers. They surely represent something big and grandiose, but they are also a bit less cohesive and more tangential. Again, the Chinese were literally sending expeditions, largely gathered also in the frontier districts, but because that's part of a much bigger system. The Abbasids in this is to have the historical problems that any other power reaching as far as that had in controlling this areas. I recently made a video about 11th to 14th century warfare in these places, and they were very unstable, very decentralized, scarce surplus, great instability, also because of the Central Asian warbanders that were swarming the Ghulams, the Mamluks. They're already called like that, just a different semantic meaning there, because there was wealth. And evidently, this clash between the Abbasids and the Tangs on this area was tied to that. The Karluks also received from China titles like prince, though relations drifted post-rebellion as they migrated west under Yabgu leadership. Under Caliph al-Mansur, 754-775, since the very beginning of his reign, the Abbasids ended Tang presence in Transoxiana, facing weakened Turkic resistance. In Fergana, Layth ibn Tarif, Abbasid commander, besieged the ruler for tribute refusal at stone-walled forts, securing peace and a hostage prince. The Andalusian rebellion allowed Abbasid expansion as Tibetans under Trisong Detsen interposed along the Yellow River band, severing Tang influence. Al-Mansur sent 3,000 to 4,000 troops to aid Xuanzong against the rebellion, who settled in Chinese cities like Chang'an and Luoyang, marrying locals and founding Muslim communities with mosques even. Arab merchants gained facilities in the process with a Cadi for Islamic law, important enclaves, and 13 diplomatic exchanges occurred from 752 to 798, facilitating paper technology transfer, which is also associated to the famous notion that at the Battle of the Talas River, the Chinese camp falling into Arab hands essentially facilitated the spread of paper making, as you know, probably in the Middle East, in Egypt, from there to Spain, and from there also, in fact, to the west, through Italy and other Christian countries. The aspect here of the Arabs managing to meddle Chinese affairs by essentially sending help to the factions in question, naturally with a specific caliphal mandate to support this, and in this case, actually the guy that basically would have to remain in power to stabilize the same China is quite fascinating. It shows the profound crisis there, but also the capacity and the will of the Arabs to stabilize the same Chinese empire, because they needed, after all, the economic contraction to stop. They needed to trade with China, and so they couldn't afford even the empire to be engulfed in civil strife. Right, it was not good for anyone, and the Arabs eventually counted very much on that intercontinental trade, because if you look at the Mediterranean, yes, they were sort of expanding, but there is also the West at this point. There is a pretty substantial sort of Western resistance, the Byzantines, the Franks, even the Longobards. There is also, of course, in northern Spain. These are all regional spaces that now are sort of fluidly consolidating. Actually, the Umayyads of Spain that have remained there, as you know, even after the Abbasid takeover, are pretty successful in the Iberian Peninsula. At some point, it will come to at least nominally control all of it. Also, the far northern communities to be namely subjected to Cordoba. However, the real center of, if you look at the Abbasids proper, in fact, is the Middle East, is Baghdad. And as such, the most obvious security you can have is maintaining an adequate control on the Silk Road, what is delving as such properly, with all the problems that also derived from the fact that Persia acted as some sort of decentralized reality. There wasn't a univocal sort of Abbasid power at this point. The regional hub is basically just Mesopotamia, all right? And so it doesn't matter how big they were, and how, of course, many provinces were formerly under probably the Abbasids at different times. There was always a great difficulty keeping things together. Big expeditions were launched against Constantinople. There was a capacity also to sort of infiltrate the Caucasus, to control some of the holy places of Islam, etc. So it's a big regional power. But at the same time, if you really get into the depths of how it was administered, a bit like the same China, you realize that there are some, not just some cracks, because civil strife is completely normal, but there are inherent limitations that, especially at this time in history, are important, are felt. And so these numbers, especially of infinitely large armies or whatever, like it always has to be resized to the actual balance, equilibrium, also delicacy, fragility even of these powers in history in general at the time, right? Pre-industrial polities. I think it was important to talk about this, to see this, if anything, from a Chinese perspective, because it's not just a very fascinating period in history, one of great upheaval, but it shows you how interconnected, again, Eurasia really was, and how much sort of attention you had to pay to the details, and to the relation with an innumerable amount of peoples that are not simply even just one or two, that they are also ruling over an immense territory, an endless steppe, for not talking about other powers that here we don't see, but a history of also northern Eurasia, is something that we should be a bit more acclimated to, provided we understand what was happening in the center and the south as well, because otherwise none of this can have sense, right? So I haven't created yet a playlist about the enemies of China, but let's say that, oh yes, I have actually. And I think I forgot to add lots of them. So, well, probably not a very watched playlist. Well, you could do worse, but yep, we will definitely look at. We made more videos about that, about medieval Chinese warfare. This is the 8th video, and it's mostly we must do really more, right? We must really do more as far as probably some more structured Chinese military history, because otherwise people don't get how characteristic this is. As far as steppe warfare instead, we have really a lot of stuff. This fits at the end of the day. Islamic history a lot, but not much actually about the early period of Islam. So yeah, we will fix some of this in any case. Playlists are always useful for this kind of work. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.